Ahoy! In the expansion, we are getting a ton of new perks that reduce damage in some ways that we can put on our armor. And that is kind of leading to a lot of questions about what's actually good now, what's bad, and what is our new best in slot for light, medium, and heavy. In order to answer that, I want to show you a few things. Now, you may remember that I still want to talk about best in slot, medium, and heavy in the current patch, and things got very complicated, which ultimately led to me not even knowing how to make that video anymore because it was just too much to somehow condense in a useful way. So for the new patch, I decided to pick a lot less variables and condense the whole thing a lot more to make it more easily understandable and easy to follow. This information is not from me, by the way. These calculations are done by someone else who would like to stay anonymous. Now I'm going to spare you many of the complexities around these numbers, but one thing we briefly need to talk about is base damage modifiers, because this really comes into play, especially in the expansion. This here is an overview that I made before the expansion with the previous factors that were changing base damage in some way, and you can see there are quite a few that can increase it, and then there are also quite a few that can decrease it in various ways. This gets amped up with the expansion. We get a lot of new perks that increase base damage. You can reach with some weapons, with the Int Great Axe, I think you can reach close to 100% base damage increase, so you effectively have 200 base damage. And we also get new base damage reduction perks, like, for example, Grid Ward. What exact base damage you're getting hit by entirely depends on who's hitting you with what, so there is no general number here. I try to use a bit of an average, around minus 30% reduction, or in other words, a 30% base damage increase to whoever is attacking you. This can sometimes be a lot more, and it can be less, but I think this is a good starting ground. And we'll also look at the more extreme case of 100% base damage reduction. So this is something that very few weapons will reach under specific circumstances, but it's something that's basically the absolute maximum that we can look at. What we'll also look at is the same situation, but with 100% Fortify on yourself, and then we'll also talk a little bit about Shirking Heals, which is also a factor here. Fortunately, what makes things a little bit easier for us is that there is no more weighted gear. All of the gear in the expansion is balanced. It has the same value of physical and elemental armor, so that makes calculations a little less complex. What we'll be looking at here is the EHP value, the effective health value, so how much health you have after all the mitigations are factored in, how much damage you can effectively survive. So our default effective health in light, for example, is roughly 24,000. Now, if we have Shirking Fortification, that would increase to roughly 25,000. With physical aversion, we'd have 24,700. With elemental aversion, we have 24,900. With Grid Ward, we have 26,350. With Enchanted Ward, we have 25,000. With conditioning, we have 25,000 after it procs, and with the health perk alone, we have 26,000 effective health. The first thing you'll notice immediately here is that health is king. Health has no other conditions, so it is just outright the best one of these perks, as you will just get this increase against literally every kind of damage all the time. Based on what the devs have said, they don't want perks like that to exist, so I would expect that health will be getting nerfed sooner rather than later. That's also why at this point I will not craft any gear yet, and I would recommend holding off crafting gear in the expansion with prismatic scarabs, because if health gets nerfed a little bit after launch, then suddenly you may need something else. Health also has the advantage that, like Shirking Heals, it has an exclusive label that doesn't interfere with anything else, so you can use this along with the other perks. This is not the case for any of the perks labeled in yellow here. Shirking Fortification, Physical Aversion, Elemental Aversion, Grid Ward, and Enchanted Ward all share the same perk pool, so you can only use one of them on your armor. Now, looking at the values in light, we can see something very interesting. With the exception of health, of course, and Grid Ward, all of the other values have pretty similar outcomes. Now, some of these would change under specific circumstances, so for example, Shirking Fortification would lose value if you already have a lot of Fortify, but overall they're all very close to each other. So the question is less what gives you the best reduction, but what kind of damage do you want to reduce? Let's look at medium and heavy first, and then talk more about what the viability of different perks for different armor weights is. In medium, we see a similar outcome. You can see all the numbers here. We start at 29,500 health, and then most of the values end up somewhere around 30,500-ish to 31,500. Again, Grid Ward stands out with 32,500 and Health also stands out with 32,200. Shirking Fortification gains some more value compared to other perks here because obviously you have more armor to work with, which is great in this context. So for example, Shirking Fortification has roughly 1,000 more effective health than Physical Aversion. Not that anyone would be using Physical Aversion in the first place. In Heavy, we again see a very similar picture. 34,000 effective health to begin with, and then going up to 35,500-ish to 800-ish for most, with Shirking Fortification having almost 37,000 health, and Grid Ward even going beyond that to 37,600. So in all cases, health stays winning because it's just, without any conditions, it's always the best option for all-around survivability. But beyond that, I think what you're doing in a fight and what kind of fight you're in is much more important based on the numbers that we're seeing here. If we increase the base damage value, so we actually go to the maximum of 100% extra base damage, 200% total base damage on the attacker, then you can see the gap with the Grid Ward especially getting smaller because that is a base damage reduction and it's a flat subtraction, so if you're adding more and more on top of that, it's not going to be as much of a factor anymore. It's still good enough though, it's not bad in terms of the reduction that it provides. If we add 100% fortification to ourselves, then you can see that especially Shirking Fortification will fall off a little bit. Again, the value of having Fortify when you already have a lot of Fortify is just a little bit less compared to when you have none. But overall, the general idea of the numbers very much stays the same. Let's have a look at Shirking Heals then, because I think that may be one of the more interesting options with this patch. The test values here are not the Shirking Heals values, these are the values that I worked with. This was roughly 13,000 base health, so what you need to know is that at this point you can see that, for example, having any of the perks in light gives you less than 1,000 extra effective health. Having them in medium gives you roughly 1,000 effective extra health, again depending on the perk here, and then roughly 2,000 when we're going to heavy. So Shirking Heals, in order to compete with that, would have to give us more health than these can provide, because it has a cooldown, it can be reduced by anti-heal, and it is something that only really comes into play once you already lost some health. But I would say Shirking Heals actually delivers in that regard. In light, we're getting 2,450 effective health out of this every 5 seconds. In medium, we're getting 3,100, and in heavy, we're getting 3,640. That is a lot of extra health. Keep in mind, you need 5 pieces of Shirking Heals for that, so this is the same as all the others, is always calculated with a full set of them. But if you can make this work for yourself and you can consistently proc this, I wouldn't rule this out as an option any longer, whereas previously I was not a fan of it at all because it was just a weaker Shirking Fortification. The problem with it is that one of the new artifacts also applies massive amounts of anti-heal very, very easily, which will very directly affect this. So this is worth keeping in mind. For example, in wars, you will probably never see anywhere near this value. You maybe see half of it. But even at half, it's arguably not awful. So then based on that, what would I actually recommend? Talking about light first, I can tell you that most of you will not have enough uptime of Shirking Fortification in light. Shirking Fortification in light is very inconsistent because you kind of roll out of the attack range sometimes and then it doesn't even proc. And even other than that, you're not dodging often enough to consistently proc it. I've watched enough VODs by now to tell you that for at least 99% of the player base, you will not have enough uptime on the Shirking Fortification perk in order to compete with other perks. It's just not something that is very easily done with how fighting in New World works, and you kind of need to overdo the whole dodging thing in order to effectively keep it up, which is, in my opinion, only really viable in medium. Physical Aversion I don't think is worth talking about much because it's just outclassed by Enchanted Ward. Most ranged physical damage is from basic attacks, and often it's also split elemental damage where this wouldn't kick in, whereas Enchanted Ward does. Enchanted Ward apparently affects both physical and elemental damage. Since Enchanted Ward also reduces melee damage against you and reduces ranged elemental attacks, I don't see how Physical Aversion stands a chance. Elemental Aversion is the one that I think will remain some competition here, because depending on what you're getting hit by more, it may be more effective. That said, I think for most light players, Enchanted Ward has more value. That's because many of the biggest threats that will attack you in the next patch will be muskets, for example, it will be bows, it will still be some fire staffs, of course, but it will also be melees that will simply be attacking you and chasing you. And when chasing a light player, a lot of the damage actually comes from your basic attacks. I know that when I'm trading with another melee, I usually use more of my abilities because I can reliably hit them, whereas against a light player that's trying to roll away, I need to weave in more basic attacks to keep them in that staggered mode where they can't dodge too far, so you take a lot more of that kind of damage. Grid Ward I don't think is really up for discussion because you're never in a trade long enough as a light player for that to really kick in and be effective. So overall, out of those perks, I would probably opt towards Enchanted Ward. That is of course along with health. And then your third perk can be something that is more focused on survivability or dealing extra damage. So you could for example have Freedom there, or you could have Cooldown Reduction, you could have Refreshing, or you could have one of the new damage increasing perks. In medium, things are very different though. The constant is that you probably still want health, but beyond that you have a lot more flexibility. I can't discuss all of that in this video. I will make a separate video discussing the whole Bruiser meta and what I think is going to happen there in the near future, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you're interested in that. But what I can say here is that a lot of options are viable. So for example, if you are going for Enchanted Ward, that's fairly effective, but again, you're probably gonna get hit by more abilities more consistently, especially if you're playing around clumps, both in OPR and a war. So this depends on the game mode as well, right? Like for example, in a 3v3, I think Enchanted Ward would have a little bit more value, whereas in a war, I think it would have a little bit less value. Grid Ward could be debated here. Generally, I still think it's not exactly effective because the uptime is not going to be that high in medium. You can't just stand there and constantly grit and survive that way. It feels a bit too risky to me. I would personally prefer going for Shirking Fortification over that. I think Shirking Fortification does have value in the expansion, and there are builds that can actually make it more effective now, in medium specifically, so that's going to be something interesting to talk about. I do want you to keep in mind though, that Shirking Fortification also doesn't have close to 100% uptime. Again, this is a very common misconception. People say that, you know, I'm dodging constantly in medium, so it'll always be up. But not every time you dodge is a time where you actually dodge an enemy ability. And people seem to not realize how often they end up not getting Shirking Fortification. I, again, watched multiple war WODs from different people now to make sure over and over that I'm not just making this up, but it really doesn't have perfect uptime for most players. So while the reduction value is higher, it is also lower through not always being up. But that's okay because I think it kind of evens out overall. Now I made a little danger chart for Bruiser specifically that I wanted to talk about in the context of the medium build that I want to show you here. This is also outdated now because things have changed here too. So Detonate, for example, will be less of a threat because it applies so much self-rend now and the damage is reduced that it's not going to be the most dangerous thing anymore. Whereas on the other hand, Graph Wells are going to be terrifying if the buff actually goes through and they scale with all the int perks on the int grade X. So values will shift around here too, and depending on what the meta in wars will be, Elemental Aversion could, for example, be more effective or less effective. But a big problem with Elemental Aversion builds that you can currently run quite effectively is that you're kind of sacrificing some of your elemental gems for them most of the time to still reduce physical damage enough, since melee elemental damage is currently not much of a problem. There's just split gems and there is Void Blade primarily, which isn't really that big of a deal because it's not really used much. With the int grade X, and also maybe a little bit with the new hammer coming into play, I think that will change significantly. There will be significantly more melee damage that is purely elemental, and that's going to be a big threat. And Elemental Aversion doesn't really allow you to split the reduction evenly here most of the time. So because of that, I think Shirking Fortification will actually gain significant value, especially in large-scale combat, in wars mainly, or also in Outpost Rush. It simply allows you to slot more elemental gems more effectively while still retaining some of your physical damage reduction. That said, in small-scale combat, in 3v3s again, or 1v1s even, I think Enchanted Ward may be at least somewhat even in value. It comes down more to the uptime that you can have on Shirking Fortification than anything else, but I think the general reduction of many basic attacks will be very, very useful because it's so consistent. And as I said, Shirking Heals also has excellent value now, so you can combine Shirking Fortification, Shirking Heals, and Health if you want to be super beefy in terms of survivability. Problem is you can't have any other perks on your armor if you do that, so it's probably not what you're going to do. There are also completely different playstyles and builds that may focus on things like rend reduction, so you may want to have those perks, for example, or you just want to go for the freedom pants and go for full freedom, so you're not affected by CC. Many options. Again, it's super flexible here. There's not a single best in slot. It's highly situational, and effectively, to really play on the highest level, you'll need multiple sets to adjust to whatever your enemy is playing. Many things are also still up in the air, like for example how effective freedom will be with the new flail, if the new flail stays the way it is and we all get constant CC immunity, or if they're nerfing that down. In heavy especially, I am leaning even more towards focusing on rend reduction, again something we'll discuss in a future video, along with maybe having some freedom as well, so you don't really have that much space to even use other perks. You'll probably be focusing on getting health primarily, and the additional effects beyond that may not be as useful as just not getting your own armor reduced. But there are definitely perks here that you could still consider. Again, I think the uptime of Shirking Fortification in heavy is terrible and not even worth discussing. But I do believe that this is the only place where we can maybe see some effective use of Grid Ward. It has similar problems to Shirking Fortification, where the uptime just isn't that great when you look at how often you actually have grid. And also with how the weapon meta is currently changing, many weapons that may end up getting used a lot may not have as much grid in general, unless you're constantly spamming basic attacks. Now, the thing is, if you're not getting rended and you're just standing in a clump and surviving everything, then you can have a lot more grid by just spamming basic attacks effectively. And at that point, maybe you can get effective use out of Grid Ward. It is a very strong reduction overall if you can consistently keep it up and if you don't get CC too much. So maybe this is something we'll see, for example, flail users opt into as well, if they are kind of playing the tanky playstyle. Again, all very open, a lot of flexibility here, a lot of room for what exactly you want to do, and that's without even looking deeper into all of the artifacts that you can also use to reduce damage in various ways. For example, the crit reduction helm, which you can technically fit into any build if you want to, or also increase your own damage or increase your own stats. This makes it straight up impossible to tell you this is what you should be running. I think the only place where I can say that is light. I think you should probably be running health and Enchanted Ward most of the time. In medium, it already depends so much on the situation, and in heavy even more so, especially on your own playstyle and your artifacts, that you have to choose depending on what you want to do. Now, I have given you a lot of information to work with and to consider for what you want to do, so I think you have a general direction of which perks will be useful to you in what way. But I really think we're at a point where there is no one-size-fits-all build, and I think that is fantastic. I will revisit this down the line when we have maybe seen some perk changes and we've seen how the meta generally unfolds, and then we can give some more specific directions on what is advisable at that very moment, and that'll probably change within a couple of weeks again. If you're interested in that and more expansion info in general, then consider subscribing and clicking the bell. If you'd like to support me further and get early trading tips and farming tips for the expansion return, then consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks to all my patrons who already do exactly that. And thank you for watching. Sloth out.